Well, welcome to our discussion on reversing the resource curse and basic running, focusing on indeed this wicked question of reversing the resource curse. I'm Chris Maroleng and I'm the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. And I'm joined today by my two colleagues to discuss this very vexing question of reversing the resource curse. And the first person on the panel that we'll be talking to today is none other than Busisipho Siyobi, who is from our Natural Resource Governance Program. And then we also have Dr. Ross Harvey, who is our Director of Programs at Good Governance, where we at Good Governance Africa are committed to improving citizens' lives through focusing on improved governance performance. As part of that mission, we've just launched a campaign called Reversing the Resource Curse that I referred to earlier on. And the objective of this podcast today is to draw your attention to our campaign and some of the relevant links which will be posted in the notes to this podcast that you're currently participating in. This is the third of our Wicked Conversation campaigns, which examine some of the very difficult problems that afflict our continent. One of these problems is underdevelopment instead of growth and sustainability. And indeed, what we are trying to unpack is how resources can indeed add to the development of our continent. Well, to help us unpack some of this is Busi, who I'll start off by asking maybe to give us a sense of what is this resource curse that we talk about, and basically why should the people who are watching this today care?
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Ross. And Chris, I think before I answer that very big question, it is important to note and acknowledge that this discussion is very fitting to have in light of the 2021 Investing in African Mining Indaba, the virtual conference, of course, taking place this week. But what is even more fitting is us revisiting this resource curse. So the term was coined and first used by Professor Richard Hotty back in 1993. And he used this term to describe how countries with an abundance of natural resources had low economic growth in comparison to countries with minimal to no natural resources. So this wicked problem, the resource curse, is often observed in developing countries, and most of which are our African countries, of course. With that being said, I think it's also important to note that there are high levels of corruption, in these resource-rich countries. They're also filled with poverty as well as underdevelopment. So it doesn't just end with the poor economic performance. So resource rent seeking and patronage have been identified as the key mechanisms to explain how this resource curse actually manifests. Now, what we mean by this is that the resource rents accrue to elites who then distribute those rents to their political supporters. And these dynamics have been critical to understand the roots of the resource curse. So in this way, the rent seeking limits incentives for the ruling elites to broaden the tax base, and then by diversifying the economy, which can also in turn maintain the autocratic rule in some cases, of course. So part of revisiting the resource curse, it also requires us to unpack the institutions curse, which can also be used to partly explain how this resource curse actually manifests. So this means that if a country fails to build robust institutions before natural resources wealth is discovered, which then institutions are likely then to fail, right? Because of the way they're poorly managed. So rent appropriation dominates in these political settlements, which diminishes transparency, essentially. Now, in order for us to reverse the resource curse and enable the extractives industry for instance, to contribute to development in a sustainable way, of course, it becomes very clear to us that the development of quality and robust institutions are a critical component to which ensure transparency in the industry, and also in a way that will lead us to real accountability. I think I'm going to leave it there for now, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Busi. Let's interrogate this question that you raised earlier on about the narrowing of democratic space and effectively how autocrats use the political system to extract rents. Maybe Dr. Harvey, you can jump in here and give us a sense of how this fits in to the question of the resource curse.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris, and thanks, Busi, for the introduction regarding the curse. So one of the specific manifestations is exactly this, that we see that resource wealth, far from contributing to development and the broadening of the political space, actually accrues to what I call aspirant autocrats or aspirant dictators who, because they have resource wealth at their disposal, can now choose to consolidate power. And so at any given moment, they can grab more power for themselves at the expense of the power sharing balance within the ruling coalition that they preside over. And part of the reason they're able to do this is because they ensure that the need for taxation is essentially diminished, if not eradicated altogether. And so without taxation, one of your critical citizen state accountability links is broken. And of course, these resources then aid the aspirant autocrat in his power grabbing moves. And part of the way in which that can happen is that the resource rents are used to increase expenditure on the military. But of course, that aspirant autocrat has to also be careful not to build a military that threatens his rule. And so part of what explains why some dictators last for a long time and others don't is largely their ability to manage threats to their rule. But this is particularly devastating because rulers that stay in power for a long time tend to amass wealth for themselves, not only at the expense of those even within the ruling coalition, but especially the broader population. And so part of why we're so intent on reversing the curse is to reverse the negative impacts of authoritarian rule on development. But of course, we recognize that it is a wicked problem. But part of why we really have to understand the different anatomies of the resource curse, especially as it plays out in the consolidation of autocratic rule, is that we need to know where the most crucial point of intervention is. And Chris, you were talking about governance being this process of the authoritative allocation of resources, who gets what, when, and how. And in authoritarian systems, this differs. But what we probably can say with universal applicability is that any sign of a power-grabbing move by an aspirant autocrat is something that has to be nipped in the bud. So we need to build mechanisms that equip citizens to put an end to power-grabbing, but also equip the international community to stand firm and to let principle outweigh pragmatism, which, as we've seen in the case of Uganda, unfortunately, pragmatism, regional considerations, security concerns can lead inadvertently to the entrenchment of autocracy, and oil wealth in that country will only exacerbate that problem.
So we've done well in sort of describing what the problem is and helping our audience understand why it's important that we focus on this. But let's focus on the what. What can we do in practical terms, Busi, especially around this question of the resource curse, to fix the problem?
Thank you for the question, Chris. So there has been great amount of work put towards governance initiatives, both at an international level and continental level as well. And of course, one of them being the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative, which is commonly known as the EITI. And this is an international initiative that aims to improve transparency and accountability in the industry, but also to better promote governance by disclosure. So as GGA, our role is to also interrogate these mining codes and also be able to see how they can be improved for the better. So with that being said, the EITI is a voluntary global transparency initiative that requires disclosure of information, right, along the extractive value chain, from the extraction to how revenues make their way through government and how they benefit the public. So this includes disclosure of contracts and licenses, revenue allocation, as well as social and economic spending. So the EITI specifically is implemented in 55 countries globally, with 26 of those being African countries. And it is also supported by governments, the industry, and civil society, and that's where we come in. So every member country, they need to establish multi-stakeholder groups which are responsible for overseeing the implementation of the EITI process and also ensure the engagement with government, industry, as well as civil society, respectively. Now, one of the main success stories that has been attributed to the EITI is its positive impact on the mineral investment climate attractiveness in implementing countries. And this has also been a renewed drive for member countries to be able to disclose all contracts or licenses that have been granted, which became in effect beginning of this year, actually. So the EITI has great potential to shift this governance needle when it comes to working with improving transparency in the extractives industry. However, and this is where we come in and where we can show how where key improvement areas where it can be improved. So you'll find that what the EIT improvement focuses is that it needs to include a more stronger civil society representation in the capacity of providing oversight, as well as monitoring and participation in multi-stakeholder groups, because you'll find that the role of civil society specifically has been severely undermined, and it has been limited and hindered by the intimidation from governments. So a good case study here that we can use is the Azerbaijan case, for instance, where the government limited the operation of the civil society organizations and also increased the operating risks through fear of being shut down. So this resulted in Azerbaijan being suspended from the EITI because it had failed to enable civil society engagement. Another key improvement area is that we would need to see that the improvement area is that seeing implementing countries work more collaboratively with government as well as the EITI in order to make sure that they are able to investigate any revenue discrepancies highlighted in the country-specific EITI reporting processes. And finally, we believe that a collaborative effort is now required between countries as well as the EITI to ensure that governments, civil society work cohesively to build institutional mechanisms that help countries to move from just mere transparency and achieve real accountability.
That's great. So as we begin to sort of wrap up our conversation, let me just ask Dr. Harvey a question here. Is this just another talk shop? Do we have any reason to be optimistic about the prospects of institutions or initiatives like the EITI to succeed?
Yes, Chris. So it's a good question, and I think when you examine this problem closely and its wicked nature, in that it is multifaceted and there are all kinds of variables at play, it is easy to become despondent. But I think that what's happened and what we've learned is that many governance initiatives are developed in a vacuum. and then externally imposed. And the result is that they are then incongruent with local level dynamics, the distribution of power, the particular institutional configuration at play in the context in which this particular code or initiative like the EITI is meant to be implemented. But what we are learning is that these initiatives can be adapted. The fact that they were perhaps conceived in a vacuum or not fully cognizant of all the local level variables doesn't mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. What it means is that we need to adapt. And in the development literature, it's being called governing with the grain. And that's really what we need to do. Now, that doesn't mean compromise. That doesn't mean that we ever accept a lack of transparency. But what it does mean is that we try to use initiatives, and this is where GGA comes in. We try to use initiatives like the EITI, as Busi was saying, in a way that actually gains traction locally because we have an understanding of these specific anatomies of how the resource curse manifests. And invariably, this is about equipping civil society to know how best to use the information at one's disposal. So you can have a lot of information about revenue flows and so on, but most of us actually don't know how to then use that information to positive political effect. But this is one of the keys, as Busi was saying, to moving from mere transparency to actual accountability and a resultant reduction in corruption, which is really what we want to see. But it takes hard work. You know, it's one thing to develop a code, and the Africa Mining Vision is fantastic. The EITI is fantastic. The Natural Resources Charter is fantastic. But these things need to all start speaking to one another. And this is where GGA plays a critical interlocuting role, if you like, and also one of convening and ensuring that we actually help governments and the private sector to work together with civil society to reverse the curse.
Sure. Interesting there, Ross. So on that note, Busi, specifically with our Reversing the Resource campaign that you are very capably running at GGA, what we have to look out for and what's out there in the future for this campaign specifically?
Thank you, Chris. The campaign will address a range of relevant and related topics, such as looking at more closely the impact of rent-seeking and patronage and how it perpetuates this resource curse, all the way through to a podcast where we plan to speak to one of our leading thinkers in the industry in basically showing us the importance of mainstreaming social performance. Now, those are just one of the key content that you should be looking out for. These topics, as I've mentioned, will be covered by lead thinkers within the industry and will contribute to the conversation. And we welcome our audience, right, to engage with us on this topic, to engage on us with this wicked problem and be able to tackle it and disentangle it, most importantly. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Busi. And of course, thank you, Dr. Ross Harvey, for joining me on this podcast where we're focused on reversing the resource curse. Until next time, take care.